Jim Jones forgave many things. He forgave financial failures and doctrinal doubts and personal weaknesses and the small daily betrayals that life inside a community of hundreds produces with the regularity of weather. He built his public identity, in part, around forgiveness, around the language of grace and second chances and the community's capacity to absorb human failing and return the failing person to belonging. The forgiveness was real, in the early years, in the way that most things Jones built were real before they became instruments. And it was also, always, conditional. Conditional on the person who had failed remaining inside the community. Conditional on the failing being managed within the architecture, confessed and judged and absorbed and converted into a tighter bond between the failing person and the whole. Jones could forgive anything that stayed inside. What he could not forgive, what the inner circle members who knew him longest describe as the one category of action that produced in Jones a response that did not diminish over time, that was still present years after the original act, that shaped decisions and organizational behavior in ways that the original act alone could not explain, was leaving. Not the theological leaving of doubt or the administrative leaving of resignation. The physical leaving. The taking of oneself out of the architecture and into the world outside it. That, Jones could not forgive. That, he pursued. There was one person whose leaving he pursued longer and more persistently than any other, whose departure from People's Temple in the spring of 1973 produced in Jones a response that the people around him recognized immediately as different from his response to any previous departure. Not louder, not more dramatic, more sustained, more personal, more organized, as if the leaving of this particular person had touched something that other leavings had not touched, as if this person's departure was not just an organizational problem to be managed but an injury that required redress in a way that organizational problems do not. The inner circle watched Jones pursue this person for years, through legal mechanisms and social pressure and the deployment of community resources toward the goal of making the person's life outside People's Temple as difficult as possible, and they understood, without being told, that this pursuit was not primarily about the organization. It was about Jones, about something the person who left had taken with them that Jones needed back, or needed destroyed. The inner circle was never entirely sure which. If you have ever watched someone pursue another person with an intensity that made it clear the pursuit was about something other than what it claimed to be about, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because the story of the person Jim Jones could not stop pursuing is not just a story about one departure from one organization. It is the story of what Jones was protecting, what he could not afford to have outside the architecture. What knowledge, carried in one person, was dangerous enough to justify years of organized pursuit? And the answer to that question, which the archive contains, in fragments, across a decade of documents, is the most revealing thing about Jim Jones that has never been fully assembled into a single account. Go back to the beginning. Go back to who the person was, the name used in the research, the name the historian who assembled the most complete account of the pursuit agreed to use in place of the person's real name, at the person's request, in exchange for access to the documents and the testimony that made the account possible, is Thomas Ward. Ward had been in People's Temple for 11 years when he left in the spring of 1973. He had joined in Indianapolis in 1962, at 24 years old, and had risen through the organizational structure with the steady competence of someone who understood systems and how to make them work. By the time he left, he was one of perhaps 8 people in People's Temple who had genuine visibility into the full breadth of the organization's operations, financial, administrative, political, personal. He had seen the books. He had attended the private meetings. He had been present for decisions that were made before they were announced to the wider inner circle. He had, over 11 years of proximity to Jim Jones, accumulated a specific kind of knowledge. Not the knowledge of a journalist or an investigator accumulated from outside, pieced together from public records and interviews. The knowledge of an insider. The knowledge of someone who had been trusted with the things that required trust and who had, over 11 years, been trusted with more and more of them. He knew where the money went. He knew what the political relationships actually cost. He knew the specific content of private conversations that Jones believed were known only to the people present for them. Thomas Ward, when he left People's Temple in the spring of 1973, took 11 years of that knowledge with him into the world outside the architecture, and Jones knew exactly what he had taken. The departure itself was not dramatic. Ward did not defect publicly or make accusations or go to journalists or government agencies. He left quietly, in the way that people leave things they have given years of their life to and are not yet ready to fully examine, with a private acknowledgement that something had ended, without the public reckoning that would require him to account for the 11 years in a way he was not prepared to account for them. He He told Jones he was leaving for personal reasons. Jones received the information with a stillness that Ward described, in the account he eventually gave the historian, as the most frightening thing he had ever seen Jones produce. Not rage, not the performance of hurt that Jones used in other departure conversations. Stillness, the kind that has nothing behind it because everything has already been decided. Ward left 2 days later, and Jones began. The historian who assembled the account of what followed is a researcher named Michael Osei, no relation to the James Osei whose incomplete biography of Jones was discussed in other contexts, who spent 4 years in the 1990s tracking the organizational and legal and social mechanisms that People's Temple deployed against Ward in the years after his departure. Osei found the account of Ward's departure and the subsequent pursuit through a combination of Ward's own testimony, documents from the People's Temple archive, and a set of legal records from the period that had not been previously examined in connection with the Ward case. What he assembled is, in his description, the most complete picture available of how Jones operationalized his response to a departure he experienced as a fundamental threat, not as an administrative problem, as a threat to something he could not name publicly but that the intensity and duration of the pursuit make visible in retrospect. The mechanisms Jones used were familiar to anyone who has studied how organizations retaliate against departing members. Social pressure on Ward's remaining relationships, the friends and family members who were still inside People's Temple and who were, systematically and without being told explicitly why, made to understand that contact with Ward was costly. Legal challenges to administrative matters that Ward had been involved in during his tenure, challenges that had no reasonable prospect of succeeding but that required Ward to spend time and money and energy on response. The deployment of organizational resources toward the construction of a narrative about Ward's departure that circulated within People's Temple and that characterized his leaving in terms that made the leaving itself seem like evidence of Ward's inadequacy rather than a choice about the organization. These mechanisms were not unusual. Organizations use them. What was unusual was the duration. The social pressure and the legal challenges and the narrative construction continued not for months but for years, for as long as Ward remained in California and accessible to the organizational apparatus that Jones could direct toward him, and the inner circle members who were involved in executing the mechanisms described, in their accounts to Osei, a quality of Jones's interest in the Ward situation that distinguished it from the organizational management of other departures. He asked about Ward specifically and regularly. He wanted to know where Ward was living, who he was talking to, whether he had been in contact with journalists or government officials. He wanted to know what Ward was saying about People's Temple in the conversations that the organization's network could monitor. He wanted to know, with a specificity and a persistence that made the inner circle members executing the monitoring uncomfortable, whether Ward was talking, and what he was saying when he did. Ward was not talking, not publicly, not to journalists, not to the government agencies that were beginning, by the mid-1970s, to develop an interest in People's Temple. He had left quietly and he was living quietly, and the knowledge he had taken with him when he left was staying with him. Osei asked him, in the interviews that formed the backbone of the research, why he had not talked. Ward's answer is the most important thing in the account. He said, "I did not talk because I did not know what talking would cost. Not to me, I understood what it would cost me. I did not know what it would cost the people still inside. I had spent 11 years building relationships inside that organization, people I cared about, people who trusted me, and I did not know, when I left, whether talking would protect them or endanger them. So I did not talk. I kept what I knew when I watched, and I waited to understand what talking would do before I did it. And then the pursuit started. And once the pursuit started, talking felt like retaliation, like I was responding to what Jones was doing to me rather than acting on what I knew was right. And I did not want to talk from that position. I wanted to talk from a position of clarity about why I was talking. I never found that position. The pursuit kept me off balance. I think that was partly the point." He paused. Then he said, "I think Jones understood that the pursuit itself was a kind of silencing. That keeping me focused on defending myself was a way of keeping me from going on offense. It worked. For years, it worked." In 1976, 3 years after Ward's departure, something changed. Ward made contact with a journalist who was, at the time, beginning to assemble what would eventually become the New West investigation. He did not provide documents. He did not give an on-record interview. He had one conversation, in a coffee shop in San Francisco, in which he told the journalist that there was a story to investigate and that the story was real and that the people inside the organization deserved to have someone looking. He did not say what he knew. He said that what he knew mattered and that someone with the institutional resources to do something with it should be looking. Then he went home, and the journalist kept looking, and the New West investigation was published in 1977, and the investigation produced the public scrutiny that had not existed before. And Jones, under that scrutiny, accelerated the move to Guyana that was already underway. And in November of 1978, Jonestown. Ward was in San Francisco when it happened. He heard the news on the radio. He sat in his apartment for 3 days. He did not leave. He did not eat. He sat with what he knew. The 11 years of insider knowledge that he had kept inside, that he had never fully deployed, that had sat in him through 3 years of pursuit and the carefully limited contact with the journalist and all the waiting for the position of clarity that he had never found, and he sat with the question of whether what he had done was enough, whether the coffee shop conversation had been the right thing at the right time or too little too late or something in between that did not have a clean name, whether the knowledge he had kept for 3 years while the pursuit kept him off balance had cost the 918 people something that a different choice would not have cost them. He sat with that for 3 days. Then he got up, and he has been sitting with it, in a different way, ever since. Osei ends his account with a question that Ward asked him, near the end of the interviews, that Osei had not anticipated and that he did not know how to answer. Ward said, "Do you think Jones knew I was going to talk eventually? Do you think the pursuit was designed not to silence me but to delay me? To keep me off balance long enough for the window to close?" Osei said he did not know. Ward nodded slowly. He said, "I think about that. Whether Jones understood that the knowledge I had was not dangerous if it came out after the community was in Guyana. Whether the pursuit was always about timing rather than silencing. Whether I was outmaneuvered not by being stopped but by being slowed. Whether the coffee shop was, from Jones's perspective, too late rather than too dangerous." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If that is true, if the pursuit was about timing and Jones got the timing right, then the most frightening thing about Jim Jones is not what he did to 918 people. It is that he understood, about a man who left his organization in 1973, that the knowledge was coming out eventually, and he built the timeline around that understanding. And the timeline held. That is the thing I cannot stop thinking about. The timeline held. The timeline held. For words Ward had been carrying since 1978. For words that organize everything, the departure, the pursuit, the silence, the coffee shop, the 3 days in the apartment, into a single devastating frame. Not the frame of a man who was silenced. The frame of a man who was timed, who was kept off balance long enough for the window to close. Jones had not needed to silence Ward permanently. He had needed to delay him past the point at which Ward's knowledge could prevent what Jones was building. And the pursuit had accomplished exactly that. Not by stopping Ward, by timing him. Osei spent 6 months after the interviews trying to determine whether the timeline hypothesis was accurate. Whether Jones had understood, at the time of Ward's departure in 1973, that the move to Guyana was already planned and that the pursuit needed to last only until the community was established there and beyond the reach of what Ward knew. The documentary record does not confirm this cleanly. The Guyana plans existed in some form by 1973 but were not formalized until 1974. Whether Jones connected them explicitly to the Ward situation, whether the pursuit was consciously designed around the timeline of the move, is not something the archive can establish with certainty. What the archive establishes is the outcome. Ward was delayed. The window closed. The community moved to Guyana. And the knowledge Ward had carried for 11 years inside People's Temple and for 3 years outside it arrived, through the coffee shop conversation, too late to reach the people who needed it while they were still reachable. The timeline held. Whether by design or by coincidence or by some combination of calculation and luck that the historical record cannot fully separate, the timeline held. Ward is still alive. He did not want his real name used in Osei's account and he does not speak publicly about People's Temple. He gave Osei the interviews because Osei convinced him that the account mattered, that the specific mechanism of the pursuit, documented and analyzed, was something that anyone who works inside an organization with a charismatic leader needed to understand. Not as history, as a warning. Ward agreed on that basis. He said, "If the account helps one person understand how a pursuit like that works, how it is designed to delay rather than silence, how being off balance is itself the outcome the pursuit is trying to produce, then the account is worth the cost of making it. The cost of making it is not small." He looked at Osei for a moment. He said, "I have spent 20 years with the timeline, with the question of whether I was outmaneuvered. I do not think the account resolves that question. I think it just makes the question more visible, which is probably what the question deserves. To be visible, to be carried in public rather than in private, to be out in the world rather than in me." He paused. Then he said, "Jones is dead. The organization is gone. The 918 are in the archive. But the question is still alive. the question of whether I was timed, whether the knowledge I had was neutralized not by being suppressed but by being delayed past the moment it mattered. I have been carrying that question for 20 years. I am tired of carrying it alone. That is why I talk to you, not to answer it, to share it, because some questions are too heavy to carry alone. And the timeline held is the heaviest 4 words I know. The account is in the archive. Osei's 4 years of research are in it. Ward's testimony is in it. The legal records and the organizational documents and the monitoring reports and the question Jones asked the inner circle for 3 years, is he talking? Are all in it. And at the end of everything in it is the question Ward is still carrying, whether he was silenced or timed, whether the pursuit was about stopping him or about slowing him, whether Jim Jones, in the spring of 1973, when he received the news of Ward's departure with a stillness that had nothing behind it because everything had already been decided, understood exactly how long the pursuit needed to last, and built the timeline around that understanding. And the timeline held. 918 people went into the jungle. The knowledge that might have reached them went into a coffee shop conversation 3 years too late. The most frightening thing about Jim Jones was not what he did, it was that he knew how long he needed. And he was right. The pursuit was not about anger. It was not about revenge. It was about a timeline. And the timeline held. That is what Ward has been carrying. Not the leaving, not the silence, not the coffee shop, the timeline, the 4 words, the fact that Jones knew, and was right.